department here again, and we are today starting on Unit 2, Topic 2, which is all about networks of exchange and trade. And what better place to start than on these Silk Roads? Okay, so there are three key eras of the Silk Roads, right? So the first era is the classical Silk Roads, right? Which is the time specifically of the Romans and the Han, right? And the reason that the Silk Roads are so successful here is that we have these large states kind of giving protection to merchants along the roads, right? The second major growth is the revival of the Silk Roads under the Muslim the Muslim trade routes, right? Right, the Muslim trade, which is in the 8th and 9th century. The classical era is kind of 2nd century to 2nd century, right? They revitalize the trade with the new technologies that help kind of create more security and safety along the trade routes, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And then the final one, which the Silk Road doesn't fall away here, it doesn't disappear, but it does decline over time as the Muslim states kind of lose some power. And the third and final revival is under the Mongol Empire, which we're going to talk about today, specifically in the 14th and 15th centuries, right, where they created an era known as Pax Mongolica, and that Pax Mongolica is the Mongolian peace, where despite the ideas that the Mongols are kind of bloodthirsty and very brutal when it comes to military conquest. Once they've conquered an area, they are actually very peaceful and enforce peace through their military strength, right? So what we're going to do today then is kind of go through the different causes of the growth of the Silk Road and the effects of the growth of the Silk Roads, right? So let's talk about some of those early causes, right? So one of the very first ones we want to point out is the Crusades. Okay, so the Europeans who interacted in the Crusades, right, brought back a lot of new goods, right? So the Knights of the Crusades bring back new goods, bring back things like spices and silk and fabrics, right? And it really piques interest in the ideas of trading for the Europeans, right? So that made the Europeans much more eager to trade internationally, especially into China, right? Another key component, especially of this kind of Muslim trade revival, is the revival of empires. Okay, so the revival of empires, right, as we kind of saw with the classical era setup, is that empires make it much safer to travel along the Silk Roads, right? And so when we see specifically two kind of key dynasties, the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Tang Dynasty in China, they really help revive that trade, especially since they actually have a border that pretty much connects, right? Not only do they revive the Silk Road, right, but they also revive the sea lanes as well, right? Especially the Abbasids, but the Tang also in the South China Sea, right? And the Tang China actually, at this point, as we're kind of rebooting this Silk Road network from the classical era, right? They have a lot of new things to bring to the table, right? They have things like the compass, right? They have things like paper. They have things like gunpowder that can be very, very beneficial to the rest of the world. And as we say, will be beneficial, but also, of course, in the case of gunpowder, maybe not so beneficial, right? Of course, the major kind of exports of China, as usual, are going to be our kind of go-to Chinese goods, silk and porcelain, and to a lesser extent at this point, tea, right? And then they imported what the Middle Eastern world, what the Muslim world has to export are usually like kind of tropical fruits or like not necessarily tropical fruits, but certainly fruits that are not available in the Tang Dynasty. But one of the key ones I really want to focus on is cotton. Right, cotton becomes a crucial good that they are able to trade. They talk about dates, they talk about horses and grapes. Right, I'm not necessarily going to write them down here, but those are good to know as well. Right. And so these new luxury goods really appeal to the upper nobility of China as well, right? Which sees to that revitalization of the second Silk Road. However, the biggest revival comes at the hands of the Mongol Empire. Mongols have the biggest revival, right? The greatest revival of the Silk Roads. Okay, so we're going to read about the Mongols in the next section, but they do capture the Abbasids, right? They take over the Abbasid Caliphate. They also take over the descendants of the Tang, the Song dynasty, right? And so they are able to utilize that control over basically all of mainland Asia to create a safe trade network, right? Right. So what we see is that for the first time ever, right, we see the Silk Roads unified under one ruler, the Mongols, right, which is a big deal, right? We've seen large states like the Romans, like the Han, like the Abbasids, like the Tang, control parts of the Silk Road, but they never controlled all of it. But the Mongols now control essentially all of the Silk Roads, right, which increases that safety of travel, right? Right, especially with the idea that the Mongols are incredibly deadly, right? You're not going to see a whole lot of crime occur in the Mongol Empire because the retribution is going to be so harsh, right? So that's probably the biggest reason for the revival, right? There are some other kind of side things that come out of this, right? We see transportation technologies improve as well. Okay, as we kind of hinted at a little bit earlier, right? One of the key ones has to be the camel saddle, right? Which not only benefited those in the Middle East, or excuse me, in the Silk Roads, but also benefited trans-Saharan trade as well, which also kind of revitalized around the time of the Abbasids as well, or not revitalized, grew. It wasn't necessarily big beforehand, right? So camel saddles not only were good for like transportation comfortability, but also they helped carry more goods, right? So that's a big deal, right? And then on top of that, we also see the concept of working and traveling in caravans, right? And caravans are super important because it creates safety amongst the merchants that are trading together in the caravans because there are so many of them, right? And then they're also protected by political states as well, right? And some stuff we've also already talked about, but of course the Chinese compass is huge for dealing with not only on-land trade but also overseas trade, especially the development of the rudder, which allows you to steer the ship, and then these two things kind of combine to really help the new type of ship, which is the Chinese junk and the Arab dhow. Okay, the Chinese junk ship are very large. That have huge holes to bring supplies, right? And the dhows are much smaller, but they're much more nimble, right? So those two types of ships are incredibly important to the development of trade, especially along the Indian Ocean trade network, right? Okay, so those are the major causes, right? Again, the Crusades, the revival of the Abbasid and the Tang, and then later on the Mongol network, and then transportation technology, camel saddles, compasses, rudders, which lead to things like caravans, junks, and dhows. Okay, let's talk about the effects of the expansion of the trade routes, right? They kind of pointed out two key ones here. Okay, the first one I'm going to point out is the growth of oasis towns, right? Right, the growth of kind of major cities along the Silk Road. And they pointed out two in particular that we do need to focus on, right? And so these oasis towns tend to be settled on rivers, which is important because throughout most of Central Asia, right, there is a severe lack of water, right, which since the beginning of time has made it very difficult for farming to occur. But there are some exceptions to that rule. Okay, one of those exceptions to that rule is the city of Kashgar. Okay, so Kashgar today is at the western edge of China, right? And this was at a crossing roads of the northern and southern Silk Roads. So the Silk Roads had a situation where the northern route would go above the mountains in South Asia, and then the southern version would go under them into India, right? Um, right, and so this was at kind of a crossroads, very similar in its success in terms of location as something like Constantinople, right? Constantinople, right, kind of sat at the intersection of Europe and Asia, and the intersection of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Okay, and so travelers began to depend upon Kashgar as a city to kind of rest and relax and get water and food. A lot of fertility in the soil there, right? They talked about how they produce wheat and rice, fruits and cotton, right? We have a lot of artisans living in Kashgar, right, which helps kind of increase their value because the merchants can maybe buy goods there and sell them, or even keep them for themselves, right? They had a massive kind of market within the city. And since we also kind of see the crossroads of ideas and goods, right? Originally, what we saw here, this is a Buddhist city. But as we see more merchants and more trade occur around through Kashgar, right, we eventually see it become a center of Islamic learning, right, as the Muslim merchants kind of overtake any Buddhist attempts at trying to convert the city. But one of the key things about these kind of cities is that you see a lot of tolerance for different religions, right? You see, it's almost a religious center in that any religion can pretty much practice there if they want. Okay. All right. So the second one we are seeing here is that we have the second city, I should say. I apologize. Is the city of Samarkand. And I believe the Kashgar today is actually located within China, but I'm not entirely sure. Right. So Samarkand is in present-day Uzbekistan, right? And so this city, more so than Kashgar, is a huge city of cultural exchange. It's a little further west, and I'll pull up a map here in a second to kind of look at the Silk Roads, right? And so it was a cultural exchange center, even more, almost more so than it was for trading goods, right? And so we see a lot of religions here that they point out: Christianity, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Islam all had some form of presence in this city, right? And then, very much like Kashgar, right, is well known for its artisans, as well as its city, its center as Islamic learning, right? And you might be wondering, like, why is Islam kind of dominating these Central Asian towns? Well, it's because Muslim merchants kind of dominated the trade routes at this point, right? So that's why they're able to dominate these cities, culturally as well, right? And they also have very nicely decorated mosques. Okay. Each of these cities tended to, as well as kind of areas within, tended to host a lot of camels, right? And so what we see created to kind of help that travel on camels is the let me make sure I'm spelling this right. I'm already writing that right there. The caravanserai. Okay. So these are basically like kind of hotels, right, inns for camel travel, right? They were about 100 miles apart, which is about how long a camel would need before it needed to fill up on water again, right? And so these kind of became major locations along the Silk Roads as people would stay here and either kind of stay the night with their camels or trade in their camels to get more camels. So these became massive centers as well, right, for trade and interaction. Okay. The other kind of key thing that we see come out of the growth, the effect of the Silk Road trade, is commercial, what they call commercial innovations. Now, what does it mean? What does commercial mean? Well, commercial is kind of is the usage of the word commerce, right? And so what we're really looking at here is trade and economic innovations, right? And so we're going to start with China, right? So China for a very long time had already been a country, a nation, a state that used money, But they use copper coins, and copper coins, if you stack enough copper coins, it becomes a little too unwieldy. And so China invents a new type of way to make payments, and that is called flying cash. So this is very similar to credit or flying cash, not quite flying cash, but flying cash. Right. So flying cash is a pretty crucial innovation. This allows people to deposit paper money in one bank. Right, so you're allowed to deposit paper money in one bank in a different city. Right, you kind of get a slip of paper that says you have this much money, and then you can withdraw it in another location. Right, so this makes merchants much safer because they don't carry money on them, right? And then since it's under their name, right, it's a lot more secure, right? You could see, maybe you could see a bandit know your name and take it, but a lot of times, right, the bandits wouldn't know your name, so you couldn't necessarily like steal somebody's flying cash. Okay. And so the kind of locations where we see this occur, right, this whole idea of like depositing paper money, kind of becomes the basis for the modern day bank, right? The model for banks going forward. Okay. Speaking of banks, in particular, right, the ones that they want to point out are the banking houses in Europe, right, which are going to become centers of wealth in the 1300s in Europe, as Europe is again growing economically, as we've already talked about in the previous section. And at a banking house, what you can do is you could present a bill of exchange. A bill of exchange is very similar to flying cash, and that basically it says it's an agreement, right, between you and the bank or maybe some other actor that says you are legally promised payment of a set amount on a set date, and you will get that money in exchange, right? So these really supported trade by just making it much more secure, much more convenient as well for the merchants, right? Okay. As we see Europe start to develop a greater demand for non-European goods from Asia, what we see then is the organization of this kind of large-scale trade, right? Organization of trade, especially in Northern Europe, and into a group of cities and states that will eventually that we call today the Hanseatic League. I don't know if it was called that back then, right? But that's what we're going to call it, right? The Hanseatic League. All right, and so the Hanseatic League was a series of cities in northern Germany and Scandinavia, and they would control trade throughout the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. Control North Sea and Baltic Sea trade. Right. And so they basically kind of created this almost this economic state here in Northern Europe. Right. They talk about some of the cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Riga, and they were able to monopolize trade. Right. So they drove out pirates. Right. As they kind of pooled their resources, they were able to more successfully do that. And then also they were able to monopolize trade in these regions, especially in particular products like furs and timber. And fish, right? And so you would even see them kind of go into Western Europe as well, and even into the Mediterranean, right? And then get valuable goods from the Arab Silk Road trading networks, right? This continues on until the mid-17th century when states become strong enough to kind of do their own thing, right? So lastly, kind of one thing to just kind of fill this all out, right? As we see an increase in demand for all these goods, right, we also see an increase in production in these goods, which leads to a massive economic growth, right? We talked about in a previous section, China kind of becomes a center of production in this time period, right? And that's definitely because of the increase in demand, right? And so we also see that kind of growth in proto-industrialization in China due to this as well. Right, the kind of early formations where you see so much production going on that they are producing more than they can sell themselves. So we see them, of course, sell it along the Silk Roads. Okay, And that's going to do it for section 2.1. In the next section, we're going to cover the Mongols, probably one of the most important societies we'll talk about. So I'll see you.